Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, Holger. It's lovely to be in Oslo despite the weather, but I'm told it's supposed to break tomorrow, so that's nice. I'm an historian, and so that means that when somebody asks me to talk about contemporary art, I usually have to start about the year 1300. But bear with me, because we will eventually get to things that are relevant. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was the whole notion of the expanded field. And it sounds like such a great idea, right? It sounds like this sort of unfettered space where you can just play and experiment and have a good time. But of course, in the real world, one person's expansion, geographically speaking, is somebody else's encroachment. So when we talk about the printmaking in the expanded field, I thought it might be useful to give some thought to who is sharing the turf that's being expanded into, and just whose flags get planted where. When Rosalind Krauss first mooted the idea of the expanded field in this essay, she was addressing what she perceived to be a kind of sloppy fit between the word sculpture and what she was seeing in the real world in terms of the activities of contemporary artists. Sculpture was like Rodin, Brancusi, you know, nice little objects you could put on plinths. And what she was seeing was land art and non-functional architectural structures, things like that. And so she came to the conclusion that in the postmodern world, the logic of an artist's work was no longer dependent on materials, wood, bronze, or on processes like casting or carving. But it also wasn't simply a free-for-all in which artists behaved randomly. What was on view in the 70s, this kind of eclectic assortment of activities, she argued was actually logically unified through, as she put it, terms that are felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation. And the terms she chose for sculpture were architecture and landscape. And to illustrate her idea, she put together this now famous diagram. I actually once attended an entire day-long symposium at Princeton on this diagram. So people take it very seriously. So the way the diagram is set up is she's got her two terms, architecture, landscape. She's got their inverses, not architecture, not landscape. And these form a quadrant over which she lays this diamond of possibilities. So site constructions like Alice Aycock's maze, 1972, would be at the top in landscape plus architecture. Traditional sculpture would appear at the bottom, not landscape plus not architecture. The general promise of the expanded field is this. If you can identify the right set of opposing terms, any domain, however rife it is with haphazard experiment and new forms, is revealed as conceptually coherent. Artists could then mess around with video and etching and carpentry and needlepoint without fear that they were just being dilettantes. The trick, of course, is identifying the relevant magical terms for your own particular domain. So the obvious question at this conference is what would be the terms for printmaking's expanded field? Toward the end of her essay, Krauss very helpfully offers up the pairing uniqueness, reproducibility, which she promptly uses to define not print, but painting, specifically the postmodern space of painting. Krauss's writings in general suggest that she does not care much about prints or print history, but she is actually right that a great deal of contemporary painting has been concerned with originality, appropriation, and replication. And yet, if you redraw her diagram with uniqueness and reproducibility in place of architecture and landscape, you hit an immediate hitch. Krauss saw landscape and architecture as mutually exclusive categories. Not landscape was the same as architecture, and vice versa. But not uniqueness is not the same thing as reproducibility. It's the same thing as multiplicity. And not reproducibility isn't uniqueness, it's more like originality. So if we substitute those terms and redraw the diagram, what it means is that we have a bottom corner, which is actually the juncture of multiplicity and originality, which is a description that fits very, very few paintings, but perfectly encompasses the artist's print. In one sense, this is a really silly exercise. There are plenty of things to quibble with in the Krauss essay, and a diagram is just a diagram. But she is one of the most influential art critics of our time. And if we are going to use her term, expanded field, as anything but a kind of pompous way of saying new stuff, we need to take seriously her contention that such fields are in some sense logically constructed. In addition, of course, speaking to this audience, the habitual sublimation of print into painting is kind of a constant irritant to printmakers. I know this because wherever I go and speak in public, I am usually asked what I think of Wade Guyton. And the answer, that I think he's actually a pretty terrific painter, is often greeted with annoyance. People have argued to me that Guyton's work is properly part of the expanded field of printmaking, since it comes out of a printer. And some have implied that Guyton's decision to describe what he makes as paintings and drawings is slippery and opportunistic. If you ask him this question, Guyton will explain that he wasn't trained as a printmaker. He feels ill-informed about the history and techniques of prints, that he has friends, notably Kelly Walker, who know all that stuff, but he doesn't. His use of an inkjet printer did not arise from a desire to engage with print, but from an urge to make something with the stuff that was kicking around in his studio, and like everybody else, he owned a computer and a printer. There's absolutely something printerly about his staging of idea, template, and output, but he did his layouts in Microsoft Word, and by those standards, every office worker and middle school student in the developed world is a printmaker. I think of Guyton's works as paintings because in person they feel like paintings. The scale is that of painting, the materials, gesso, linen, pigment, are those of painting. The compositional conversation invokes Agnes Martin and Bryce Marden. Like Andy Warhol or Richard Hamilton, Guyton pulls ideas that are fundamental to print, reproducibility, repeatability, syntax, aura, into the materiality and social space of painting, where we look at them differently. As Jasper Johns observed, things which are necessary to printmaking can be used in painting where they're not necessary but become like ideas. Now, just to be clear, it is not irrelevant that painting wields greater clout in the art world. Money is not the measure of all things, but it is a very useful indication of power. Of the 70 most expensive artworks ever sold, and artworks, by the way, are the most expensive portable things on the planet. Of the 70 most expensive artworks ever sold, 68 are paintings, 2 are sculptures, and they're down towards the bottom of the list. In May 2014, you may know this story, Guyton painting was up for sale at Christie's with a $3 million estimate on it, and he got annoyed at a number of reasons. He was annoyed with the collectors, he was annoyed with Christie's. So he booted up the digital file, which he still had, and he printed out 3 dozen more paintings and posted the photographs and a little video of them drying in the breeze on Instagram. And this got reported in the New York Times, and there was this brouhaha, and there was debate throughout the art blogosphere. Had he actually just printed $108 million in an afternoon? If not, in what way was the one at Christie's fundamentally different or more valuable than the ones that he'd printed that day? What exactly do people think they're paying for when they buy art? If the work at Christie's had been included in the print sale instead of the painting sale, if it had been billed as a giclée, God forbid, or had been valued at $3,000, this whole discussion about technology, valuation, uniqueness, and multiplicity would probably never have taken place. A print that cross-dresses as a painting, one that is unique or hand-painted or huge, simply does not have the kind of clout that a painting that cross-dresses as a print has. And it's simply because when the powerful take on attributes of the powerless, it's not seen as transgressive, it's just seen as aspirational. Women wearing trousers cause much less fuss than men wearing dresses. So printmaking is always going to be in this position relative to painting. These are just kind of social truths, but I can easily see that when you look at something like Rosalind Krauss saying that uniqueness and reproducibility are critical issues for painting, it can kind of look like painting just stepped up to the podium and elbowed printmaking out of the way to deliver the kick-ass speech that printmaking actually wrote. But it actually is not, this relationship is not a modern thing, and now I'm going to like do the historian thing on you. Printmaking and painting have been codependent since the absolute beginning. Painting as the exemplar of individual expression and poetic epistemology comes into existence basically in the 15th century in Europe alongside prints, presses, and paper. There were painted images before, of course, but they behaved very differently. A 12th century icon of the Virgin was not an expression of an individual artist. It was a link in a chain of replicas that hopefully led back to the moment when the Mother of God sat down to be painted by St. Luke. With the advent of prints, though, something new happens. In addition to replicating the pictorial composition, they contextualized and explained it. Christopher Wood uses the example of a German woodcut of the Virgin Hodegetria. The image points to the Virgin, but it has this text cut into the block that explains that the image is replicating the real image and that the real image is in Rome. What printed reproductions give us for the first time is the idea of a painted original. So, to take just one example, to our eyes, the Raphael Madonna and Fishes is not the Virgin, but a Raphael. It points to a specific historical person. And since it was hidden away in a monastery for most of its life, the magic of its Raphaelness was worked through reproduction. And for centuries, printmaking embraced this double role. A collector would cherish the engraving as both a Raphael and a Marcantonio, the brilliant composition of one and the brilliant adaptive syntax of the other. Félix Bracquemond won entrance to the Académie des Beaux-Arts with this etching, which is a reproduction of Bouguereau's Nymphs and Satyr. In the late 19th century, however, Bracquemond becomes instrumental in the etching revival that promotes a new entity, the original print. So etchings like this pointed only to themselves. They don't point anywhere else. Artists of the etching revival repudiated, in the words of Théophile Gautier, photography, lithography, and all engravings whose recrossed hatchings show a dot in the center. Reproductions were no longer going to be allowed to do double duty as art. By the 20th century, the artist print formally renounces its defining power of reproduction when we get the signed and numbered limited edition. When the artist's signature migrates from the matrix to the paper margin, it's an assertion of material specificity. It's no longer the image that's authored. It's that exact sheet of paper, those specific molecules. And what's happened effectively is that the print has rebuilt itself as painting. We reach the apotheosis of the solipsistic artwork in the mid-20th century. A Stanley William Hayter engraving, like a Pollock canvas, is both artifact and autobiography. It tells us about the urges, instincts, and experiences that produced it. Both the print and the painting point only to themselves. So at this point, painting is still defined against the replica as it always has been. But the replica was now the endlessly disposable photomechanical reproduction. Printmaking enters a prolonged period of cultural irrelevance, which isn't to say that there weren't good prints produced or great prints produced. Obviously there were. But from the cultural critical standpoint of somebody like Rosalind Krauss, they didn't offer anything that was categorically different from what painting offered. With the paradigm shift of the late 50s and early 60s, art began to look outward, to examine the conditions not only of its own making, but of its reception at social and material contexts. Sculptors stopped worrying about bronze and began working with architecture/landscape. Painters began to explore reproductions, effects, and affects. The field bulged outward. As production methods became detached from categories, the number of copies was no longer logically or inevitably related to the means of production, and multiplicity becomes an instrument of strategy. The ideal of industrially produced, inexpensive, yet original art blossomed with Fluxus, multiples, and artists' books. At the same time, print shops producing limited editions flourished. These developments are often celebrated by myself as much as anyone as signals of a fundamental shift in print's relevance to contemporary art. And yet, to be honest, the structural relationship between painting and printmaking was pretty much what it had been throughout the 20th century. It was just that now, instead of both examining their own internal conditions, they had both turned to flirt with mass-market, low-rent reproduction. And for the most part, contemporary art's supposed transgressive embrace of reproduction and multiplicity has been entirely a feint. The paintings of Warhol or Christopher Wool are clearly understood as unique works of art. Multiplicity and reproduction became the subject of painting and printmaking, but we are in no way confused about which is which. Guyton's Epson printed canvases, the Tobias brothers relief printed paintings, Glenn Ligon's Come Out paintings, which were screen printed at Excel Editions in Brooklyn, could all theoretically be positioned as editions, but their impact would be different. When these same artists produce prints, they're clearly distinguished from the unique work. They're usually smaller, they usually are reliant on different technologies, they're done in proper editions, signed, numbered, documented. As Christopher Wood observes, to represent the copy is to reassert the distinction between the copy and the original. So, should we just accept the idea that the expanded field of printmaking and the expanded field of painting are one and the same thing, that they can both be demarcated neatly by Krauss's uniqueness, reproducibility, opposition? I don't think so. To begin with, there are just too many things that don't fit. Where, for instance, do we put William Kentridge's lino cuts or Tasta Dean's photogravures? These are clearly original prints, but they have more to do with film than with painting or sculpture. The print, as much as it is painting's twin, is also proto-filmic form. State proofs effectively constitute frames in an animation of image development. Prints have always lent themselves to narrative sequences, whether you're talking about Durer's Life of the Virgin or Lewitt's squares with a different line direction in each half square. And the strategic sequence of plan, direction, production of parts, editing, and assembly into something coherent is also shared by both modes. Similarly, where are we supposed to put Richard Archschwager's Locations, or Swoon's street-pasted woodcuts, or Damon Davis's All Hands on Deck? These are all works that are clearly on the uniqueness reproducibility spectrum, but they're equally fitted to the architecture/landscape spectrum. Each offers what Krauss would call a marked site, but the potential of multiplicity is also key to their poetics of contingency. In fact, site specificity can be seen as a strategic response to reproduction. It tells us that any object is embedded within a larger framework, and that reproduction catches only a tiny part of that context. A century ago, Duchamp's ready-mades made it clear that the experience of art is a product of the attention we bring to it. Rauschenberg took the argument a step further when he said, "There is no reason not to consider the world as one gigantic painting." The problem is that our brains cannot pay art quality attention to everything at the same time. Neurologically, we're always performing attention triage. Events we think will be repeated demand less of an immediate investment. The rarer event, the one we perceive won't be repeated, the more valuable we find it. When we think of the art event and the art work as identical, any object that exists in multiple is at a disadvantage. We can encounter it and re-encounter it, and we have no reason to expend particular attention at this moment in time. But when we define art experience in terms of the relationship between the object and its setting in time and space, then everything becomes a unique work of art. A Felix Gonzalez Torres stack piece is simultaneously a unique sculpture and a limitless set of multiples, each spawning its own installation. The one thing it is not is a painting. Multiplicity turns out to be a far richer property than painting can make use of. Just to give a couple of examples at two ends of a spectrum, this is a Richard Tuttle project done for the January issue of Art and Print this year, which is effectively an optional artwork. If you leave it bound in the journal, it's a reproduction of a drawing like anything else. But if you follow the artist's instructions and cut it out, which is incredibly difficult to do, and install it in the place of your choosing, it becomes a singular work of art in a singular situation. So it isn't a work of art pretending to be a reproduction. It isn't a reproduction pretending to be a work of art. It fully occupies both positions. In its own small way, Tuttle's work recaptures the borders between the free-roaming reproduction and site-specific original. The facsimile of Paolo Veronese's Wedding at Cana, made by the digital fabrication firm Factum Arte, does this at a much, much larger scale. Full-size, ultra-high resolution copy is installed in Palladio's refectory in San Giorgio Maggiore, which is where it was originally made for. And after it was looted by Napoleon and taken to the Louvre and installed in the Louvre, it went up about, I think, 5 years ago at San Giorgio Maggiore. And so viewers today have a choice. You can go to Paris and see the actual molecules that Veronese painted in an object that is hung at the wrong height, in the wrong light, in the wrong building, with tourists backing into it because the Mona Lisa is on the other side of the room. Or you can go to Venice, which has no 16th century molecules in the painting, but is visually indistinguishable from the original and is hung in the exact space for which the artist had designed it. At the entrance to the refectory in Venice, there is a little display that details the history of the original and shows photographs of the scanning and fabrication and installation of the facsimile. So before dropping into the glory of the room in its setting, the viewer has been prepared to think about the experience in terms of uniqueness and reproducibility and site and non-site. So it's an open question whether the piece in Venice operates as a reproduction or operates as a work of art. With all this in mind, I might propose another set of oppositions to accompany uniqueness and reproducibility: object and time. This new expanded field could accommodate Gonzalez Torres stack pieces, repeatable time-based works like film and video, installation projects that are neither coherent objects nor moving time, the recent proliferation of steamroller printing events, screen print parties, mobile print stations, and shop front studios that have lately transformed printmaking into a kind of performative theater of labor. By now, I have built Krauss's tidy little diagram into a kind of tottery expanded skyscraper in which print is everywhere and nowhere. One could argue that printmaking, now as ever, is a kind of traveling salesman making the rounds of everybody else's expanded field. Or we could say that print actually owns the ground on which all these expanded fields lie. The logic and mechanisms of print now pervade virtually every mode of contemporary art practice. Technical and material mastery is routinely outsourced. Artist-instigated models are executed through the skills of a range of fabricators and the intervention of mechanical devices. The intercession of templates, mediation, and repetition is so pervasive that we don't even notice it anymore. But if I were to choose a pair of terms felt to be in opposition, to define specifically the expanded field of printmaking, it wouldn't be any of these. It would be context and fragment. These mark the duality at the heart of replication, both conceptually and logistically. They are also at the heart of our struggles with time, with space, with memory, and with meaning. So I could draw a diagram, and I would show how sculpture and painting and film are all conceptually and materially beholden on the print. It would be tidy and satisfying and possibly even convincing, but it wouldn't necessarily be true. The fundamental problem, it seems to me, with the expanded field as an idea is that it was laid out by a surveyor and not by a farmer. Surveyors scan acreage from a distance and as a kind of abstraction. Farmers may do that, but they also have to deal with dirt. And I don't think most artists operate, as Krauss writes, in a rigorously logical progression. I think they navigate between concept, intuition, circumstance, and the demands of the physical world. Jared Diamond argued that throughout human history, invention has been the mother of necessity, not the other way round. Art comes about because people are by nature tinkerers, and we look at what we've made with an analytical eye, and sometimes we find meaning that leads us forward to the next bit of tinkering. For artists, this tinkering is often, not always, but often, rooted in materials and processes: copper, paper, wood. Ernst Gombrich's famous formulation about the origins of representation was that making comes before matching. The postmodern update might be making comes before meaning. Even Saul LeWitt, who famously wrote that execution is a perfunctory affair, didn't actually believe it. The statement was a rhetorical slap at modernism, as anyone who's ever looked closely at a LeWitt etching knows. As observers, we can set fence posts wherever we like, but we should recognize that seeds are always going to blow past them, and they're going to take root in unexpected places. In the end, it's always up to the artists to figure out whether they're worth cultivating or not. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Susann Tallman, for your very clear and very interesting lecture. I'm looking forward to talking about that afterwards. The next lecturer is Jen Law. She's an artist as well as an anthropologist writing on contemporary art. Now, that's interesting. She is chair of programming and exhibitions of the Open Studio Contemporary Printing Center in Toronto. So her lecture will focus especially on transference, printmaking strategies in making art. So we're looking forward to hear what you have to say, Jen. Thank you. Give her a warm applause.